think we're live. Hopefully this time we really are.
We're live to start.
How are you doing, Allison?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Dave?
I'm well. We finally have sunshine in Wisconsin after 40 days and 40 nights of near biblical rain. So things are beginning to look up here.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that anyway.
Yes. Can finally get outside and avoid other people while outside. But get outside to do it.
Yeah. I got out again. I got out and took my 7 o'clock walk this morning, and it was already, 80 degrees. Vicky was watching the thermometer and said that while I did this couple of mile walk, the temperature went up by 7 degrees or something like that. So, you guys enjoy your rain and nice cool weather while you can.
I'd rather have 100 degrees.
Indeed. Now, have you actually spent any time back in Arizona since you
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I go back every Christmas. So
okay.
Yeah.
So you still actually have the heat tolerance that
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've never been cold tolerant. I like being warm.
Okay.
So
how long have you been in Wisconsin, Dave?
37 years. Straight out of Miami University, and when I brought the little magazine, there used to be a little magazine called Deep Sky magazine that I brought to astronomy too, and I came up in 1982 and started the magazine as a quarterly here and became the junior assistant editor of Astronomy magazine. And I found out if you stay around long enough, they put you in charge of things.
it's a good strategy.
Indeed. Okay, so one of my favorite science fiction novels from back in the day, and that's actually a long list. Sometime I'll have to, were I to open the door behind me, what you would see are bookshelves full of rows upon rows of old science fiction paperbacks, and I don't want to admit how many of them I own, and I don't want to admit how many times I have moved the large stack of boxes from place to place. But somehow throwing away a book that I've read is just not in my constitution.
Not allowed.
Not allowed. It's wrong, but not allowed. Rendezvous with Rama. Dave, you read Rendezvous with Rama, surely?
I did not. I was so busy. Everyone I knew was a huge sci-fi person in my whole life. And I was so focused on reading and trying to figure out reality that I never did much sci-fi reading.
Oh.
You're never going to talk to me again now.
I'm never going to talk to you again. I think you just dissed us. That's what I think.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, I'm the abnormal one. I get that.
I don't know. A lot of astronomers are actually not nerds, which is kind of disappointing, but at least to me.
Well, is it really disappointing?
To me, because I am a nerd. I was hoping I'd found my people, and I'd found some of my people, but not all of my people.
Well, okay. You say not nerds. Not nerds is a very relative statement.
I guess, yes, they weren't like Trekkies like I was expecting, let's say. I
Right.
got into all of this because of Star Trek, so
Really?
I expected that everyone else. I wanted to be an engineer because I wanted to be like Geordie LaForge. And then I took one engineering class and was like, never mind, I'm going to do physics. So that was how that happened. I mean, I'd already been interested in space, but Star Trek was definitely a big part of it.
Of course, I experienced my age just then. I thought you were going to say I wanted to be like Scotty.
Like Scotty.
Yes.
I mean, I've also seen the original series, but I started watching Next Generation. That was still running when I was, starting to really actually pay attention to television. So my grandma watched it every weekend. So it's her fault.
Funny, our oldest daughter, who wound up going into physics and astrophysics, started out in engineering. And she started out in engineering, I'm sure, because having been raised by an astrophysicist, she knew better than to think that we ever made any money or anything like that. But during her freshman year, she called one day and said, I'm doing well in my engineering classes, but I just don't know that I can stand the thought of spending 60 hours a week in the presence of these people for the rest of my life.
I would also believe that. Engineers are even more special than astronomers in my experience. So
right.
At some point, as they say, money isn't everything. Hey?
Right. Yeah. So being the Trekkie, my segue would have been, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, because our first interstellar visitor looked a lot like the spaceship in that movie.
All right. Okay. So
which I
good
believe
segue
I was the only person
anyway.
that
Tell us
noticed.
about interstellar visitors.
So our first recognized interstellar visitor was Oumuamua, which we saw in 2017. There probably have been many before that, and will be many more, but that's the first one that we were finally able to confirm had come from another solar system. The problem is that we saw it very late. We saw it basically after it had already swung around the sun and was headed out. We didn't have very much time to study it, even with Hubble. For example, a lot of people are like, well, why didn't you just look at it with Hubble for a long time? Well, they tried, but it was very faint. Because it didn't really look like your typical comet either. So a comet has a tail, it gets brighter as it comes in. This did not necessarily. There was no visible tail. There's still, I believe, a lot of contention over whether you want to classify it as an asteroid or a comet, depending on who you're talking to. There was no coma or tail. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a comet. Maybe we just didn't see it. But shortly after that, we had another interstellar visitor that was definitively a comet. So that's Borisov, which I believe is probably still visible. I really should know this, and I don't. But I think don't ask me why I don't know this. I think it's because I wrote about it and then promptly put it out of my mind. But that, again, they were able to study as it was coming in. So we saw that on its, inward trek toward the sun. We saw it develop a tail. We were able to look at the gases coming off of it. And that one specifically looked very similar to comets in our own solar system, which is very interesting because the makeup of these objects will basically tell us where they formed, because comets, asteroids, planets all form out of the same material as stars. And so if you look at what the comet or the asteroid formed out of, then you can say something about the star around which it formed and the material that was there before the star was there. Oumuamua, they weren't able to tell as much. The most unique thing, at least according to Karen Meach, was its shape. It was very long and skinny, and that's very unusual. We don't have anything like that at all in our solar system. Which is weird.
Of course, the fun thing about, back to the Rama story, Rama was this very long, and it just, so you hear about the cigar shaped thing, and it's just, until you hear, Rama was doing this very nice thing of spinning around its axis and producing artificial gravity and wonderful. And
Oumuamua was not doing that.
Oumuamua was tumbling. So,
it had this 3-axis weird motion based on what they were able to see, which again was very strange. Why is it doing that? A lot of different reasons it could have been doing that. So Oumuamua, I think, is very interesting because it's still this mystery. We can't learn any more about it. We learned everything we're possibly going to learn. People are obviously still going back through the data and trying to get more, but we can't get more data, I guess is really more what I should say. So you're working with a very limited amount of information on that kind of object, which was the first, which is what everyone wanted to know about.
Okay, now
It's really, really small. Oumuamua is maybe from between 100 and 1,000 meters long.
Yes,
and
very
does
small.
look like that Star Trek also in, I forget the episode name, but, cigar-shaped spacecraft.
the Doomsday Machine?
Yes, Doomsday Machine was the other one.
I mean, that's what everyone thought, when they were bombarding us with messages at the magazine. That suddenly Captain Kirk was out there, but it's small. But Borisov is more like the typical size of a solar system comet,
right?
Much like in the 6 to 10 to 12 kilometer range for the nucleus. So it's possible, this thing, is very, very small, Oumuamua, and tumbling. And, it may be a defunct comet. We don't know, but we do know that, it's one of the 2 shades of a comet or asteroid, dark or really
or
dark.
red. Yeah.
And we know that, they're reddish as well because of the long cosmic ray exposure and the decomposition of organics on the and the tholins on the surface. But as you say, Allison, there clearly were numerous interstellar visitors. There used to be this clean line, of course, between comets and asteroids.
Oh yeah, and now there are not. That was some of my undergraduate work was on that, actually.
Exactly.
So yeah.
And there will be many, many more of these things in the future as well. And it's really cool because if you look at where this thing, Oumuamua came basically from the direction of Lyra.
Yes.
And it could have been traveling, without a star for an incredibly, incredibly long time.
Yes, they still haven't been able to trace it back. So
that's exactly right. Yeah. So it's fascinating that there are lots of these sort of rogue objects probably between organized, nice collections of stuff that are still gravitationally bound to their suns.
Right. Right. So there's probably a lot of stuff flying in between stars, and it's small and dark, which means we may never see it, frankly.
But isn't that kind of a cool thing that you could be out there in the vast interstellar universe without anything much around you and just kind of on this trip and slowly tumbling around, and you're also orbiting around the galaxy. It's kind of a neat thing that you don't have to belong to this huge family of trillions of little bodies altogether.
Yeah. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but you ought to be able to say things like, we've seen 2 of these things come through. So how many of these things have passed through over the life of the universe, and
I wrote a lot of studies on that.
What's the total mass of these things? And I mean, what is the fraction? Maybe we're getting a little technical here for the audience, but just
I think I left most of that out of the story because it was just me being interested in it. So I don't remember the numbers exactly. And I mean, of course, there was like 1 paper because we had a sample of 1. So based on this sample of 1 of size, X, we expect to see, Z number of things. I feel like those numbers are still kind of a shot in the dark. And as we start to recognize more of these interstellar visitors, those numbers will become more rooted in reality as opposed to them just, not that they're not rooted in reality, but they're based on a lot of assumptions, obviously, like some science, can be when you don't have a lot of data, you have to base it on assumptions. The more data we get, the more accurate these numbers will get.
But solar systems are very, very, very tiny objects.
Yes.
Which means that if shooting at random, you're actually getting a couple of these things through over the course of a few years. Would mean that, it's like you've got a gun and you're shooting it off in random directions, and somehow twice you manage to hit the dime at 5 miles or something, which means you probably had to shoot a whole lot of bullets.
It's a lucky shot, isn't it? Because think of the incredible volume that's mostly empty space between stars and solar systems. You're right. It's a lucky shot. It's like John Wayne at the end of, Liberty Valance, going up and kablam, just hitting the guy right on the right second at the last,
but no. That was John Wayne. John Wayne never made a lucky shot in his life. Come on. It was always... God, that was a great movie. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. The line from that what was the final line that when the myth becomes,
when the legend becomes reality, print the legend, and that's a great line. And John Wayne telling Jimmy Stewart that, hey, what are you worried about after all? You're not the man who shot Liberty Valance, the great, denouement of the movie. Yeah.
Right.
The reveal. Yeah. It's a great film. And you think it, not to get lost here, but we have COVID and all sorts of other things. But, John Ford, you start with Stagecoach with the introduction of John Wayne, and you wind it up with Liberty. That's a pretty good career of making Westerns for John Ford there.
Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah. Absolutely, it is. A pretty good career indeed.
We won't even get into Dr. Strangelove today. Later we will.
There you go.
Promise?
Only so many movie references per episode.
Absolutely. We need to get into Doctor Strangelove. You know it. You know it. But okay, so where were we when okay. So but it can't be a lucky shot in this case.
No, it's just
not
there's
like
a
it's
high
not
flux
like
of
there
these
were
things, and
two shots and
you know.
it
There
says that there just have to be a bunch of them out there.
There have to be lots of these guys floating around. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And I think as more surveys start covering more of the sky, they've renamed LSST to the Vera Rubin telescope. Well, it's the Vera Rubin Observatory. It's not the Vera Rubin telescope. I can never remember the name of the telescope.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's now the Vera Rubin Observatory. The telescope is named after, I think, someone who donated money to it. So I cannot remember the name of the telescope, but that telescope, for example, will cover the sky like every 3 days or something, if not less than that. And so they're expecting to see a lot more of these transient objects because you're looking and you have the ability to look and you have the ability to see faint things with this large telescope. Our numbers may increase dramatically of things that we see like Oumuamua and Borisov as the telescope becomes operational in the mid 2020s. So not too long from now.
No, that stuff is just very cool. Vera Rubin was a great, wonderful person.
Thank God there were so many people I got to meet and get to know, at least as near the ends of their life. Thank goodness Vera Rubin was one of them. She was a terrific woman.
Yeah.
And you knew her, I think, reasonably well, Jeff, I imagine.
I didn't know her extremely well. I knew her. The other person, the stuff that we're talking about here that jumps to mind, or the other people, are Gene and Carolyn Shoemaker.
Oh, yeah. Well, they were almost like surrogate parents to me around Flagstaff because
really,
Brian Skiff and David Levy were good pals of mine early on with with my little magazine, Deep Sky Monthly. So I started making a pilgrimage to Flagstaff in 1980. And ended up spending a lot of time with them. And of course, at that point, they were around USGS and Flag there. Gene had already done his reworking of an entire field of science, of impact geology, had trained the astronauts, so on and so on and so forth. So they were around always, and Bobby Buss was out there, and Chris Lugenbuehl, and so we kind of hung around, and Gene and Carolyn were sort of like parental figures from these screwy little kids who were hanging around Lowell Observatory, wanting to know about all this cool stuff that was going on, and they were the nicest people in the world. And of course, it was one of the worst, darkest days of astronomy when Gene lost his life in Australia, of course. Yeah.
Although I thought it was so, the fact that Gene lived to see Shoemaker Levy 9, well, Gene and Carolyn. I mean, Shoemaker Levy 9 was actually named after Carolyn and Dave Levy.
That's right.
Gene.
That's right.
But for the two of them to get to see that thing then break apart and smash into Jupiter was just great. They were, I would run into them. I overlapped with them quite often at Palomar. I was observing it.
And David was with them at Palomar as well.
Yeah.
Doing stuff often with the 18-inch Schmidt.
Yep.
There. Yeah.
In fact, it was kind of fun. I remember a night when, you eat and it's a crummy night, so nobody can work. And Gene took me over to the 18-inch Schmidt and showed me all of the ways that they were using at that point to actually find things. And it was really kind of cool because at that time, now of course you do everything with computers and it's great, but you didn't have computers then. The computer that you had was, this thing on the top of your head. And the way that they did it was they weren't even doing blink comparisons, but what they would do, of course, what you do is you take a plate, and then you wait a while and you take another plate and you look for things to move. But that's, how do you look for things to move if you don't have a fancy computer? One way to do it is you look at one plate and you look at the other and you go back and forth and you look for something that's doing this.
Just
other,
yeah.
The other thing that you can do, though, is you can line up the two plates where you're looking at one plate, you know, through a binocular thing, you're looking at one plate through each eye. And if the motion is along the direction perpendicular to your, you know, along the direction between your eyes, then these things look like they pop out. You know, they look like either they're in front of everything else or behind everything else. Anyway, he was absolutely great people.
Fantastic. Yeah.
But
and Carolyn, I saw last year, is still around and in very great spirits, and a wonderful woman, and really recharging to see her again. But it was before this peculiar now emergency that we face now, which is frankly still very daunting. How's that for a little bit?
And still has a lot of things that we don't know about it, which is the challenge, really.
Yeah. I mean, as scientists, it's like, oh, isn't it cool? There's this virus, and I was reading an article in Science magazine the other day that was talking about how when this thing first came along, they said it attacks the lungs, and that's what they knew. And we can talk about what it does, because it's sort of again, as a scientist, is neat. And now it turns out, well, it doesn't just attack the lungs. It attacks the inside of the blood vessels, and it causes clotting and strokes, and it attacks the liver, and it attacks the kidneys. And now they're saying that we've heard so much about respirators that what we're not hearing about are the shortage of dialysis machines for people who've had this.
Right.
And that it's just a really, really bizarre virus that does bunches of things that people had not really seen before. I mean, we were talking, what is it, FIP the other day, Allison?
Yep.
And I have not read into similarities between the two, but it's sort of starting to sound
I think they're somewhat similar. I mean, again, they're both coronaviruses, so they're kind of essentially target things the same way, although I don't know about, again, whether FIP is just respiratory or not. I will ask my mom and come back with this information. She will know. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, because we have seen other coronaviruses, and this doesn't behave necessarily like those that we know of anyway. I'm assuming, with like SARS and things like that, either they killed too quickly or the numbers were too small. But now we have a very large worldwide experiment going to see exactly all the ways in which this can affect people.
Yep. And a nationwide experiment going to see just under what conditions the thing can propagate in more or less unrestricted ways. But I mean, it's just, again, as a scientist, you look at this thing and there are just so many things that we don't know, that the scientist says, oh, this is cool. There's all of this stuff to learn, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you have the stuff and you're lying there on the bed, you would really rather people
would really rather they know exactly what they're doing and what to give me to make me not die.
Yeah.
Well, and the problem is we're finding out, it seems to be in many cases early on very much like pneumonia. But Jeff, you were talking a little bit earlier today with it. It's what happens is cellularly and in the lungs is very, very different than mimicking pneumonia, isn't it? It's very much more serious, in fact.
Oh, it's incredibly serious. I mean, I don't want to go too far down that path, in part because we could talk about it for a long, long time, and in part, well, actually, we could talk about it forever and bore people out of their skulls. Even though it's not boring, it's really pretty cool. And we could also just completely terrify people, and but it really is amazing stuff, because it was understood fairly early on one way that it did its thing, where it comes along and it attacks the cells in the lungs that produce this stuff called surfactant. And basically what that does, again, excuse me for the technical terminology, but it reduces what's called the surface tension on the alveoli. The alveoli are the little sacs deep in the lungs where you actually transfer oxygen and carbon dioxide and such.
And this is why people feel so early on and so suddenly with this disease, so short of breath.
Yeah. Because what happens is it causes, when the surface tension goes up, that has the effect of taking these little bubbles and making them go scrunch. Mm-hmm. And now you've got the problem that to breathe, you're having to, it's like the difference between trying to blow up a really stretchy, well-used balloon and trying to blow up a really stiff, fresh out of the box balloon. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the nice stretchy balloon, it's easy to breathe. But when you're trying to breathe, when your alveoli have collapsed like that, it's like trying to blow up that tiny, or that fresh out of the box. But then more things happen. Without going through all of the details, the immune system responds. It responds in ways that causes lots of inflammation. And so now you're not only trying to blow up this balloon, but you're trying to blow up this balloon into this swollen stuff around it, and that resists what's going on. Fluids come pouring in as part of the inflammation. And now you're trying to breathe through, you know, it's kind of hard to do the gas exchange now with all of that fluid in there. You get these things called cytokine storms, where white blood cells are releasing messengers that are bringing in more white blood cells, that are releasing messengers that are bringing in more white blood cells. And the white blood cells are doing what they do, except instead of just attacking the virus, now they're attacking the insides of the alveoli. And you wind up getting the things that we rely on to breathe filled with junk. And so, you know, at that point, not only can you not breathe mechanically, but there's just no place to do the oxygen exchange. And at this point now, you're not doing the oxygen exchange, and so your blood oxygen plummets. And as your blood oxygen plummets, then organs throughout your body start failing. The other thing that happens is that these cytokines cause your blood vessels to expand, and so your blood pressure drops way down. And now we're understanding, just very recently, we're understanding that they also, again, attack the insides of blood vessels. They attack, you know, the virus attacks directly. It's even been seen now in, the virus has been seen in fecal material and such as that, so it can get all the way through the system. And it's just, you know,
So we understand really the severity of this now, and some people can contract this and don't get terribly sick, but for those who do, they need the ventilator, and it's really a downhill vicious cycle. It's really bad for the people who are susceptible, whose immune systems don't fend this off quickly. And yet today we have hundreds of people apparently protesting in Michigan State Capitol to get back to normal. So what kind of a society is this that we live in terms of the information that's available, is what I wonder today. Allison, what's your
take, Allison?
We're trying to have a
I can't answer that question using a vocabulary that I should probably be using.
It brings to mind the saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I like a double-edged sword. We have a lot of information out there. There's the correct information, which you want people to get. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of incorrect information that you don't want people to get, or that you don't want people to focus on. And, you know, some people have a much easier time differentiating between these types of information. And, you know, again, two people can listen to, you know, what the president says about disinfectants and hear totally different things, despite the fact that he's saying exactly the same thing, depending on, you know, what you know and many other things. But it's kind of problematic, almost, the amount of information, because, and it's also, again, coming out every day. So while I believe that, you know, obviously this is an ongoing scientific process, we're learning more, and as more information becomes available, we're making it available. You know, we thought drug A worked, well, it doesn't, so now we're going to try drug B. The problem is that when you release information like drug A may work, people start hoarding that drug and taking that drug even though they're not supposed to. So it's a little difficult to say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that there is so much information available right now. I mean, I personally don't think that less information is ever good. More information is always better, but it requires, you know, you to be able to sift through that information, which is difficult.
If you can figure out how to actually tell the difference between reliable information
and it's difficult. It's not, you know, it's not necessarily just a matter of having a PhD or having gone to college or having gone to high school even. It's still very difficult to tell what is the correct information. And again, sometimes that even changes. Again, we can say drug A works and come back a week later and be like, oh, wait, no, it doesn't actually, but we thought it did. And
well, but a lot of that is actually appreciating the process of science.
Yes, which a lot of people are not familiar with, I think.
And understanding that, yeah, uncertainty is a real thing.
Right.
And yeah, and I think I would argue that an awful lot of I think arguably the biggest problem that the United States faces in terms of our future, quite frankly, is the large-scale rejection of scientific knowledge, the large-scale rejection of the idea that there's a difference between things that are true and things that are not true, and that there are ways to tell the difference. You know, I actually write, in fact, for the magazine, one of the early pieces that I wrote for the magazine was titled Postmodernist Airplanes. And the statement was, never get on an airplane built by a postmodernist, you know, someone who rejects science as the right mode for knowing about the world, because it's just not a smart thing to do. You know, airplanes don't care about what you want to be true. They actually behave according to the laws of physics and do their thing. But in this case, the uncertainty with COVID, as we were saying, just goes to the core of it. And this thing is only a matter of a few weeks old, and we're starting to see remarkable things, like in, what is it, New York City, that was, of course, the first really hit hard by COVID in the United States. I say first because it won't be the last, especially since we're, you know, we have those folk out there who, by golly, want to be cannon fodder for the wealthy. Although I will say, I think it's kind of fun. Tomorrow is May Day. And if you know about May Day, you might know the role of May Day in the birth of organized labor and so on and so forth. And there is a huge protest across a bunch of different companies planned for tomorrow. People will walk off work for a period of time, protesting bad working conditions and unsafe working conditions, and the people who are making billions and billions off of this thing, while at the same time asking their employees to work under circumstances where you're seeing large numbers of them die. Anyway, if you look at New York City, where we've got the question of, okay, we talked about this as a pneumonia. And so when people come in with a pneumonia and they present at the hospital, you can count number of cases, and then you can say how many of those die, and you're all set. Except that people have started just looking at how many people have died in New York City. And so in the period between, what was it, March 1st and April 4th or something like that. So early on in this thing, over a period when there were 8,000 deaths that you could actually directly tie to COVID, there were something like 15,000 excess deaths in New York City. And that's a similar thing to what they're seeing in countries, throughout Europe. They're seeing similar things. They're seeing similar things elsewhere in the United States, and those numbers are increasing. And that's kind of a startling statement, that we are grossly undercounting the number of people who are dying during this pandemic. And we are not entirely sure why.
And despite the undercount, still yesterday we passed the total death figure from United States citizens in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Yes.
In just the last few weeks.
Yeah.
So this is a, even that aside, which is undoubtedly true, you can read the statistics on it. It's getting to be a staggering number, even the conservative figure of casualties here. Why? Here's a question for both of you. If you're, people know what's going on by and large. It doesn't take a vast amount of.
Define know what's going on by and large. I'm going to push back against that.
Why is it so difficult for some people to differentiate the quality of the sources of information? And I mean, I'm not talking about.
This is a bigger question than just this.
Just media.
This is a different show. Yeah.
I'm talking about, from believing everything from what they dream all the way up to the repeated methods of science. Why is it that most people, probably 80% of the people in this country, just believe what they're told? Because authoritarian figures, and they choose their authority and they believe that. And that's not actually how thought is supposed to work in a human brain.
What do you I'm going to push back on that too. What do you mean that's not how thought is supposed to work in a human
independent thought? Because you've got your own mind that you can use to think about things logically if you want to. And
so
everyone doesn't do that, which is astonishing to me.
So I'm probably going to, I don't even know what I want to say here, but in a way, it may go back to how you're taught things in school. Because at least when I was in school, the teacher was correct and they told you what the correct answer was, and that's how you learned. And I think that has changed a lot since I was in school, and probably since you were in school. But there are some cases in which case these are facts and these things are true and they're facts, they're not going to change. But I think, again, obviously it very much depends on where you live and when you grew up and how you learned. But I think independent thinking and problem solving are not necessarily emphasized in a lot of educational programs. And
I did go to a laboratory school that was run by Miami University for the kids of university professors.
So you probably got much more independent thinking practice than I did.
We were taught to think independently, and despite that, we knew that part of the time the teachers were full of shit anyway. So I granted come from a background of skeptical thinking, which is maybe unusual, but it's not that hard. It seems to me to differentiate between some of the sources of credible information and lunatic nonsense that's out there now.
But people also want to be told what they want to hear.
There's not a subtle difference here between many of these ideas.
The thing is that you are used to a period that is actually unusual in history. You look at the entire history of the world prior to what we think of as the beginner. We think of it as the scientific revolution. Really, it was the beginning of a scientific revolution that's still ongoing. And their whole, you go back and you talk to folk, the medieval folk, and it was authority that they turned to. The notion of actually looking at the world and figuring out what's going on, that's not what you did. You just turned to authority. Whether it was reading Aristotle, or whether it was reading Holy Writ, or whether it was listening to the Pope or whatever, you just listened to authority, and that's what you did. And really, if you think about it, modern civilization is a result of people learning to reject that, and instead ask the question, well, what is the world really like, as opposed to what I've been told it's like. But if you go back further than that, I mean, we've talked about this. You go back.
I know, but it's fun.
It's fun. I know it is. Few things. I'll be honest. If I were going into a science right now, as much as I love astronomy, astronomy is not what I would go into right now. I would go into neuroscience and including evolutionary neuroscience, just in a heartbeat. I think that we are at a point right now where we are seeing a scientific revolution in neuroscience to match and possibly to outstrip the revolution in science that took place in physics at the beginning of the last century. I mean, it's just amazing, the stuff going on. But if you look at it and say, okay, our brains were shaped by evolution, we are a profoundly social species. When you lived on the savannah, you relied upon your social group for everything.
Survival, literally.
Survival, literally. And saying, I think you guys are crazy was probably a pretty good way to make sure that you weren't going to become anybody's ancestor.
Right.
Everybody out of the gene pool. And so, if you have a group of people and you say, this is my group of people, and my group of people believe something that's just completely outlandish. They believe that Trump is a good president or something like, just completely mind-bogglingly ridiculous. Believing that becomes the price of entry into that group. And you cannot reject that, because rejecting that cuts you off from your group, and cutting yourself off from the group is the one thing that people just do not do.
So just as with 100,000 years ago, it's more important for people to feel a sense of belonging than really care about understanding what the truth is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think...
Will that ever change?
Will humans ever change? Maybe not.
Well, we are incredibly adaptable. The fact that we have done so much of that, the fact that the three of us are members of a community where the thing that our community expects of us is to reject that kind of conventional wisdom. I mean, in a sense, I think that's a lot of the success of science. To say, here's a community, and we're people just like everybody. We feel that same need to be part of our community, to belong, all of that kind of stuff. It's just what our community expects us to do is to question, and is to push back, and is to shoot at ideas and see what ideas can survive.
Well, and I think a lot of people want to believe that they're skeptical thinkers, but to them, skeptical thinking is questioning literally everything. Whereas real skeptical thinking is questioning everything, but then letting that lead you to the facts, which convince you of the truth, essentially. And I think the word skeptic has kind of become synonymous with not believing anything. And it's that whole thing where science is now is not belief based, it is fact based, it is experiment based. And I think somehow those things have gotten mixed up. And so a lot of people want to envision themselves as scientists or skeptical thinkers or, you know, informed, you know, citizens or whatever, but they're really kind of shutting themselves in and closing themselves off to accepting things that have been scientifically proven.
Yeah, I mean, climate change is an example of that, where, you know, people who call themselves climate skeptics are not skeptics at all. You know, they are sheep with rings in their noses that are being led along. No, the oil companies want me to not believe in climate change, so I'm not going to believe in climate change. Skepticism, as we understand it, you know, being skeptical means that you look at an idea, and instead of taking that idea at face value, you challenge that idea with data. You try to show that it's wrong. You look for its flaws. And then if it can withstand that kind of scrutiny, then you say, all right, whether I like that idea or not, you know, it might be an idea that I just abhor. You know, early on, I just abhorred the idea of the accelerating expansion of the universe. I thought that was just the ugliest thing ever. But what I thought didn't mean anything, and the data keep supporting the predictions of that. And if you're a scientist, you understand that it's the data, it's reality that ultimately matters rather than what you want to be the case. And that's what skepticism is. That's what it means to be skeptical. Except people say, well, I'm skeptical of climate change, which just means that I don't want to believe it, so I'm not gonna. Or I'm skeptical that COVID is worse than the flu, even as death rates become extreme, and you know, it's so we're at a situation where we're in the midst of this thing. We don't understand really all the ways that it kills. We don't understand whether having it actually conveys immunity, which means we don't know whether there are going to be, you know, 3 or 4 or 47 additional waves of this thing. We don't know how many people are dying of it. We don't know how many people have had it. The reason we don't know all of those basic things is because we as a nation have failed miserably in just about every way it's possible to fail miserably. The fact that we're this far into it and we still are not testing people is just, you know, why is it that we don't know whether these deaths are you know, we know they're associated with COVID. Okay. It's not happenstance that COVID came along and suddenly in a place like New York City, the death rate jumped by a factor of 6. Now, all of those might not have been direct COVID deaths, but all of those excess deaths probably would not have happened were it not for COVID.
That would be one hell of a towering coincidence. Right.
Yeah.
That would be one hell of a towering coincidence.
Yeah. Well,
and in the face of all of that uncertainty, what are we doing? We've got people who are showing up, as you said, at the mission capitol carrying guns, saying it's my right to go out there and infect everybody I want to. I don't know. We are in a crucible, and coming out the other side of the crucible, either we will have rediscovered science, or there won't be an awful lot left to look at and believe that we were once a great country. It's just, anyway.
Well, let's hope it's the former, and we'll get to that and talk about that much more next time.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Allison. As always, it's been fun. Thank you for watching, and we hope to hear from you soon. Check out the website, and we will talk to you next time. Still being stuck inside.
Which will be Monday afternoon.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.